in the last two classes, I kept putting off the historical context and some background information about Hosea, but I think it might be a good moment to give you a little bit of that. In some ways, for the Nivuot that we've been reading, you know, this extended and very complicated and, you know, very difficult to decode. No, this very metaphor that's very complicated, easy to decode the basic meaning of the metaphor, but the delivery of it, the vehicle for the metaphor, presents very difficult, has, you know, as we've seen, presents some very difficult, complicating issues for us. And it's such a powerful metaphor, right? It's the metaphor about the relationship, about Israel's abandonment, apostasy, betrayal, promiscuity, worship of many pagan gods. And and Hosea's job is to communicate God's anger about this to the people. And in some senses, and it really does transcend, it's a metaphor that we see in other places in Tanakh. And we talked last time, and we'll talk about this again, why this metaphor, why using a loving relationship between a man and a woman is so powerful, so effective, and so sacred in so many Jewish texts. You know, maybe starting with Hosea, going, interesting how it gets into Shir HaShirim, certainly Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, Yechezkel, and then through rabbinic literature and piyutim that we read. You know, maybe when we finish all this, we can look at some of those piyutim. You know, it's a metaphor that really explicitly personifies God, right? Anthropomorphizes God, but in a word that my husband likes to use, it doesn't just use God's human physical qualities to represent God, as in most famously Yad Chazakah, you know, a powerful outstretched arm taking the Jews out of Egypt, but also anthropopathically, you know, God's emotions, right? It uses explicit human emotions and intimate human emotions to reflect God's inner life almost, and God's reactions to the Jewish people. So it's a very powerful metaphor, but in this case, we're going to talk a lot about, this is what we're going to, you know, we're going to read some texts about this today. What do we do with the fact that the Hosea, the Navi, the prophet, is asked or seems to be acting out the metaphor, that his life becomes the metaphor at God's command? That gets very complicated. And also just, we're not gonna, you know, eventually we're gonna get to the question of, there's 3 chapters which, where this thread goes through the first 3 chapters, but it's really complicated and ambiguous how to put these 3 chapters together, even though they seem to be talking about the same thing, and they're certainly using the same metaphor. But just for the moment, I want to, you know, back up a teeny bit and give you a little historical background, but also a little bit of just, you know, some background, some context for Hosea as a Navi. I think that there will be, you know, a moment when we're going to want to refer to that. And even if we don't refer back to that today, I'm uncomfortable with teaching anything for 2 and going into the 3rd week without giving any historical context, right? So, you know, what we know is, and we know this from the first pasuk, you know, which is the introductory, which in many of the Nevi'im, the books of Nevi'im, but not all, give us, you know, a later editor probably gives us a historical background. So we know it's Hosea's career happened. We don't know exactly where the beginning and end of it is, but it happened during the later years, the last period of the the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, sometimes known as the Northern Kingdom, sometimes known as the 10 tribes, sometimes, characterized as Shomron, because Shomron was the capital city. The same way we might say, when we're talking about France as a whole, we might say Paris, right? So it's this northern kingdom, separate from Judea, Yehuda, the southern kingdom, and this kingdom is going to be destroyed by 722. The king who is associated with Hosea in the northern kingdom, in that introductory verse in the book, is Yeravam ben Yoash, Yeravam II, actually, and he presided over actually a very secure and prosperous period for the Jewish people. After he dies, the northern kingdom, pretty much the government, the kingdom, descends into chaos, with dynasties overthrowing dynasties and, total instability. 1 minute, please. I think my laptop is getting tired, needs charging much more often. So this, it descends into terrible instability until it is finally destroyed by the extremely barbaric Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. And that, so during this period, so Hosea has a contemporary. He actually has a number of contemporaries, and the Gemara speaks to this. Arba'a Nevi'im nib'u b'oto haperek. In the northern kingdom, Hosea and Amos are speaking to the people at the same time, to the same audience, so to speak, to the same nation, to the kingdom of Israel. Hosea and Amos, and in the southern kingdom, in Yehuda, Yeshayahu and Micha are talking to the people of Yehuda, that's why I took it back. I wanted to qualify. It's not exactly the same audience because there is a different culture in Yehuda and Shomron. So the messaging is somewhat different, but I want to say two things at this point. Number one, there is another Navi in Israel who may be probably close to contemporary of Hosea and Amos, and that is somebody who you all know, Yonah. And, the Navi Yonah, who is sent to deliver his message to the people of Nineveh, capital of Assyria, and encourage them to do teshuvah. Keep that in mind. I think we might come back to that. He's probably not in the list at the Gemara. He of course has a book in Trei Asar, but he has a narrative. There's another narrative part of his life is in Sefer Melachim, and I think we're going to talk about that at one point as well. But very importantly, so I guess 2 points that may come up, in today and in the next class. One is, and this relates to the job of the Navi as well. A Navi, right, we talked about the fact that a Navi's job is to communicate God's message to the people. That is his primary job. But part of what a Navi does as well is he looks at the world around him and he looks at the nation, right? A Navi isn't, it's always tempting and interesting to compare. We don't have Nevi'im nowadays. Our religious leaders are rabbis, let's say, or rabbis for some of us. So Maharats for some of us. So, or whatever. So, but a Navi today, a Navi is not a spiritual guide to individual people necessarily. No, it's not. You don't see that. A Navi is not somebody that who someone would come to and say, I'm having trouble with my faith, or I'm having, right, and can you help me with my faith, or with my, my behavior, or with my marriage, that kind of thing. The Navi's primary relationship with is the Jewish people, right? And they're national figures, right? I was going to say that the Nevi'im are all speaking to the people at times when the Jewish people had autonomy. And that's partially true, but not entirely true. But, you could say that the last three of the classical Nevi'im, Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, who are talking to the Jewish people during the time of Shivat Zion, they're bringing them back to a time of hopeful autonomy. But primarily, the Nevi'im are talking to the Jewish people at a time when they really feel their nationhood, right? Not a people who are scattered but share religion, but there's a real sense of nationhood. And the Nevi'im are speaking to the nation. So in Hosea's context, what that means is he's thinking about the future of the nation. And he's thinking about the future of the nation in theological terms. He's looking at the nation. He's looking at the national culture and intuiting how God is thinking about the nation, the culture of the nation, the religious culture of the nation, and so on. But a Navi, being a national figure, is also, and we see this in almost all of the classical Nevi'im, they're also looking at the geopolitical backdrop, because that is going to impact on the nation. So again, if you think, we think nowadays, we think in very individual terms, right? If people maybe talking to a rabbi are worried about, maybe they've violated halacha, maybe they've done something immoral, maybe they're in a crisis of faith, and they're thinking about their relationship with God on a very individual level and what might happen to them. In Hosea's time, he's thinking on a national level. What are the consequences of when he looks out at the people and he sees, severe problems in their religious culture? He's concerned with what will happen to them as a nation. And when he thinks about what might happen to them as a nation, he is looking to the northeast. And what he sees in the northeast is a rising empire, a rising superpower of Assyria. And when he thinks about Assyria, and this is very important, he is looking at a nation and an empire which is famous all over the ancient Middle East, maybe more than any empire even since, for its barbarity, for its viciousness, its violence against the people whom it conquers. And we know, because we know the end of the story that even Hosea doesn't necessarily know. We know, because we look back in history, we know that what ultimately happens in 722 BCE is that the Assyrians sweep down into the northern kingdom, into the kingdom of Israel, and totally devastate the land. They were famous for a scorched earth policy where they destroy the lands which they conquered, and for their really barbaric deportations of entire populations, right? And and their scattering of these populations into their empire so that they would never be able to function and rise up against them again. So Hosea, first of all, as a national leader, as a Navi to the nation, is thinking about the nation's religious culture, and he's also thinking, and he's thinking about history. When he thinks about what this means, this religious culture means for history, he is thinking this is a very clear, it's very clear that he is not just imagining, Assyria has already had incursions into the northern kingdom. This happens in stages. He knows what kind of devastating, barbaric, violent punishment might await the Jewish people if they do not return to God. So that's very important to imagine about Hosea. But also another really interesting thing is that Hosea, his contemporary, is his colleague, perhaps, although there's no mention that they ever know each other or communicate with each other. But his contemporary with a similar mission is Amos. And Amos and Hosea, speaking to the same population at about the same time period, during the same time period, have different preoccupations. Amos, some of you may remember, is primarily preoccupied with social justice, with the social, moral corruption of the Jewish people, right? That's his messaging is primarily about that. Hosea, not so much. Hosea's concern, when he looks at the culture, the religious culture of the people, his concern is their abandonment of not God. They're not abandoning God. Nobody in those days, it was a very, nobody would abandon any God for that matter, certainly not a God of their people, but their abandonment, their betrayal of God, their embrace of other local gods as well, in particular the Canaanite gods, the Baal and the Asherah, those gods. And he characterizes that as prostitution, as promiscuity, right? Israel is, and that's his main concern. His main concern, and he expresses it as a total violation of the covenant, of the brit, a total violation in his metaphor of the marital relationship, right? What's difficult for us here, what we're going to be, going into, what's hard is how extraordinarily violent it is. We've mentioned that. We read a little bit of the second chapter of Perek Bet. Even before that, I want to say something that I find very interesting, and I don't know if I ever thought of this before, but I think not more than any Navi, but more than most of the time, I think, Hosea, and especially in these chapters, is very focused on describing God's reaction. God's, in other words, he's talking about the people and to the people. In other Nevi'im, in Amos, for instance, Amos describes in a lot of detail the nature of the corruption of the people, the social corruption. What are the sins of the people? How they hurt, how they oppress, the weak, right? He goes into detail on that. Hosea, especially in these chapters, the woman's, because we're in the metaphor, the woman's sin or the people of Israel's sin is betraying God, is worshiping all these other gods. But he spends more time talking and imagining and trying to communicate God's, almost, I say this like a little bit with trepidation, but God's quote unquote, kivyachol, inner life or inner reactions to this. And obviously he's doing this. He's not a theologian. He's not trying to really explain to us the nature of God. No such thing as a theologian in those days, officially, right? His main, entirely most important and only goal is to communicated to the Jewish people to bring them back, to warn them of the consequences in the most intense way he can. But he spends a lot of time doing that, which is a little bit, I have to think more about all the other Nevi'im. She's not alone in doing this, but there's a lot of it, especially in the first 3 chapters, talking about God, describing God's anger in a lot of detail. Give me a second. I want to come back to what I wanted to say. I will say, and I'm going to say something else. In Tanakh, whereas using Amos as an example, we get to hear a lot about the people's corruption, the details of their sins, the details of their immorality, of their social injustice. We don't hear their voices much, right? You don't hear, like, using the metaphor, it's not like marriage therapy where you get to hear the husband and the wife, or like court where you hear the defendant and the what's the other one? Whatever, it's 2 sides. Although there are some court cases that are sort of staged by the Nevi'im, but anyway, I'm meandering on this. The one place, interestingly, I think where you hear, and it's a love, it's in Shir HaShirim, where the love metaphor is used, and it's a duet between the male lover and the female lover. And in the metaphor, it becomes a duet between God and Israel, and you actually hear Israel's voice. You hear, and you hear it throughout Shir HaShirim. If you want to ever take a quick look at the beginning of the 5th chapter, Perek Hey, you hear, the woman, the knocking on the, it's that narrative of Kol Dodi Dofek. You hear the woman who in the metaphor is the people of Israel. You hear the people of Israel kind of struggling with their relationship with God. What should I do? And so on. But you certainly don't hear that in most other places in Tanakh. It's a great idea. It's a great project to sort of look for that. I'm not sure where else it is. But in Hosea, in the chapters that we're learning in Hosea, the wife is silent. Anybody remember her name even? And we read it, Gomer. She's so silent, she's almost erased, I mean, there are a lot of women in the Tanakh, we know their names, right? And even if we don't have a lot written about them, and even though they don't dominate, we know their personalities, we know who they are. We know almost nothing about her. We only know, we know almost nothing in these 3 chapters, which relate to her. So that's a thought too. But so with those thoughts, let's go back into the, what we're gonna do is, let me start sharing as I talk. Okay, here we go. Here we go. So I'm glad you're taking me out of Tanakh. Here's a little comment about Zoom. I take a lot of, I'm learning a lot on Zoom myself. And sometimes I find, I don't know if it's more on Zoom than in a personal class, I find I zone out a little bit when the teacher reads the Tanakh to us in Zoom. I think maybe so, and there's a part of me that wants to read the first chapter again, but I think you've all been here and you have a sense of what it is. So I don't want to take the time to do it. It pays maybe next week before we start. I think I would encourage you to just read it again to remember. Okay, I want to go straight to what we started to do last week. Just give me 1 second. And that led to, remember, the first chapter introduces Hosea, the Navi. It seems to be his first mission as a prophet, maybe his first experience, his first revelation, his first, maybe his inauguration, his Hakdasha, perhaps. I'm not sure. And God commanded him to take Eshet Zinunim. I want to make a quick comment on that. Eshet Zinunim, very hard to translate, but I want to make a very clear point and to say that it doesn't say Kach lecha isha zona, right? In other words, the word zona is a prostitute and appears throughout Tanakh, and it refers to a professional prostitute, right? It's also not, and I think it's important to say this, there's also another category in Tanakh called a Kedesha. And it's unclear exactly what that is. Perhaps a woman who's engaged in some sort of pagan temple prostitution. I don't think we need to go into that, but I just want to clarify that that's not what it says here. And I think the translations are a little awkward, but Eshet Zinunim, it can mean a lot of things. It's kind of ambiguous. Does it mean, it could mean a woman who's been involved in prostitution. It could mean a woman who is behaving like a prostitute. It could mean a woman who has the potential for adultery or for promiscuity. It's really not clear exactly what that means. And I'm just leaving it like that for now. And I think that's very important. And one reason I think it's important, and I read something that sort of helped me with this. One reason I think it's important is that as much as it sounds horrible, it would have been horrible to hear God command a prophet to take a prostitute as a wife. You know, prostitutes were sort of an accepted part of the landscape in that society, as it seems they have been throughout human history. But a woman who gets married and commits herself to a marriage and then becomes promiscuous or has been promiscuous or has tendencies to that, but commits herself to the marriage, is actually a closer way to, a more accurate way to express what the Navi is trying to express about the Jewish people, right? And it's possible to say that it makes it worse.
Could it be that perhaps it's like pointing out that this is her way of being, as opposed to?
Yeah. I think I think that's a better reading of it, almost grammatically from a literary point of view. What that means in real life, I don't know. And really, all of these 3 chapters are ambiguous in so many ways. And as we started to see last week, the commentators, the rabbis, modern scholars, Christian scholars, feminist scholars, everybody really struggles with this. And they try to, and everybody has really, there are so many different ways of seeing that. As I sort of tried to reflect for you before, how did you say it, Robin, again? What was your language?
That perhaps it was just like her way of being.
Her way of being, exactly. And that's a better way of saying it than to say she had tendencies towards, right? But related to that, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, more like it's like her character to not be.
Okay. But it's, different people read it differently. And let's leave that open. I don't know. And maybe we'll see it in some, maybe having it, paid attention to this, maybe we may see some of those various ways of thinking about that in the rabbinic commentaries that we'll see soon. So hold on to that. Anyway, he's commanded to take her as a wife. She has 3 children. And very important, from the very outset, the metaphor, it's clear that it's in the Navi says from the very beginning, God is telling him to do this, and he is telling him that he is acting out a metaphor. Why do you have to do this? I'm doing it because the Jewish people has prostituted itself from following God. All right, and then she has these 3 children, and each of them are named like a progression of names that become more and more harsh, reflecting God's anger and anger and alienation from the Jewish people. First, Yisrael. We'll talk. We actually will come back to that historically. Lo ruchama, I will not have compassion. And then lo ami, you are not my nation. Okay. And then I just want to remind you that the very next chapter is like following immediately is this powerful expression of as bad as it could get, as alienated as this couple could possibly be from each other, as much as harsh and alienated as God is from the Jewish people, right? Of course, we don't hear about the wife's feelings, and we don't hear about the Jewish people's, but as horrible as that is, immediately there's a reconciliation, there's a restoration. The Jewish people will be like sands of the sea, echoing the covenant of Abraham, which cannot be measured. And instead of being said, you are not my people, you will be called B'nai El Chai. Okay, so let's look now. So this presents all sorts of, let me just show you something very beautiful that I think is worth noting now. Maybe that we'll come back to it. There's a beautiful Sifrei, Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rabbi Akiva, amongst the many great things that Rabbi Akiva did, was he paid very close attention to the text of Tanakh. And he was very interested in commenting about, like, into the minutiae, the details, the granular details of how the language of Tanakh is created. So Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kol parasha shehi smucha lechaverta lamda himena. Any section in the Torah which is juxtaposed next to another, that is meant to be learned from. What do we call that? Smichut parashiot. That's a famous principle of, biblical interpretation. Then Rebbe says, I've skipped a lot here. These, Eli, dots mean that there was a lot of examples in between that I left out. Rebbe Omer, harbe parashiot smuchot zo lazu, urechokot zu mizo, kerochak mizrach mima'arav. Yes, but there are also many adjoining sections in the Torah which are as far from each other in terms of meaning and conceptually as like the East and the West. What does one verse have to do to another? And one of the proof texts that he uses for this, clearly there are a lot of others until here, but similarly, are Pesukim, Bahayu, Atem lo ami. The first chapter says Atem lo ami, right? I think that's how the first chapter ends, very harshly. And then immediately the second chapter is Bahaya mispar hai, and the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sands of the sea, which cannot be met. I like the sands of the sea, by the way. We should talk about that after, which not the sands of the land, the sand of the tree. I love that. But, and then he gives, Rabbi Akiva gives kind of an analogy to that. But what I love about that is just Rabbi Akiva, it's like he's reacting to that. You can imagine Rabbi Akiva reading this and saying, what just happened? These are two smichut parshiot are supposed to connect, but here we have a smichut parashiot, we have a juxtaposition of two sections with each other, and they're as far from each other as east and west, meaning Rabbi Akiva had a very strong reaction to this harshest description of alienation, and all of a sudden reconciliation. And he's actually saying to us, he's noticing something that I think we don't notice, because I don't know, we just read Tanakh and we don't get shocked by it somehow. We just don't react to it the same way. He's saying, whoa, what just happened? How does this happen? And he's recognizing, I think, what the intent of the Navi was, the intention of the book is, as bad as, which is as horrifyingly awful as this marriage can be, they can reconcile. They will reconcile. I mean, I can almost I don't know, can this marriage ever be reconciled? Can this marriage be saved? Yes. As horrible as it is, she's committed adultery 6 times and abandoned and blah, 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 but they can come together. Their love is so deep. Rabbi Akiva is really hearing this. Now remember, he was, he's quite a romantic himself, right? And he loved Shir HaShirim, but he's really recognizing this. Okay, so last week we looked at the very famous Gemara in Pesachim. We saw the rabbis giving this episode, this Nevuah, a backstory, right? You remember? And let's just, I don't want to read it again, but just to remember, the rabbis are clearly perturbed by this. Whoa, God, why are you telling this to the Navi? Why are you telling the Navi to do this, to act this out? And it's not enough for them. They're not totally satisfied with the idea that the Navi is acting out a metaphor in his own life just to tell the people, just to communicate it to the people. They're saying there's something more behind this. And the rabbis say in Pesachim, the rabbis are saying God is commanding Hosea to do this in order to correct something like a shortcoming in Hosea himself. The rabbis are saying God is insisting that Hosea experience the abandonment, the betrayal that God is feeling, from the Jewish people. God is forcing Hosea to experience that in his own life. And then being asked to take this woman back, right? And I got a little ahead of myself. My sentence was going on too far. But he's asking Hosea, the Navi, to experience that horrific sense of abandonment that God is feeling in order to also understand how God takes the Jewish people back. How immediately in the next chapter, how immediate and how overwhelmingly God is able to take them back and be totally and restore the relationship and be totally in love again, right? And he does this. God, in this backstory, he tells Hosea to take this Eshet Zinunim, have 3 children with her, and then he tells him, and we're going to see this later. You'll see some of the acting out, some of the details of this narrative will actually come up in chapter 3, but you'll see that. We don't need that yet. Take this woman, have 3 children, experience her at the betrayal, when she prostitutes herself, she acts promiscuously, but also when God tells him, throw her out, throw the children out, God wants Hosea to have that impossible experience of, I can't throw her out because deeply, I love her so much. Okay, yeah, Robin, 1 second. Because I love her so deeply. And despite everything that she's done, I can't bear to throw her out, right? And in that way, correcting her, because I left out some of it, of course. What God is essentially saying, according to the rabbis, is you can't act on your anger, your impulse, you can't act impulsively on your anger. Hosea has the impulse to throw them out because he's so deeply invested or identified with God's anger. And God is saying to Hosea, if you want to understand me, Hosea, God is saying, you need to understand both my sense of abandonment, but also my absolute unconditional love for these people. And so you need to be able to hold both of those, Hosea. To be a Navi, you need to hold both of those. Wait, so Robin, question or comment?
Just something that struck me as we're reading this is you were saying that the time period of Hosea and Yonah were the same. And it almost feels like Hashem is treating Hosea the same way he did Yonah, like with the tree, and let me show you what it feels like. And now you want X, Y, and Z, and he's doing the same thing with Hosea. It's interesting.
So I think that's so true. And we can play around with that more later. In other words, in both cases, I'll just, for everybody else, just for a minute, because there's a kind of a very important difference. In the case of Yonah is rejecting, Yonah is so identified with the, he's so preoccupied with the evil in Nineveh that he cannot imagine how God can forgive them, right? And God is saying, no, Yonah, you have to, you need to understand the part of being, what it means to be God and what it means to be a Navi is to be able to understand both the anger and to have that anger at the horrible corruption of Nineveh, but also to equally hold out that possibility of love and teshuvah and restoration of the relationship, which is really why we read Yonah on Yom Kippur, to teach us the same, that as much as we may have disappointed God, and even as much as we feel we might have disappointed and betrayed God and sinned, God will always, love us unconditionally and will always accept our teshuvah. And that's really, and not to mention that the people of Nineveh really did a sincere teshuvah, right? Anyway, so I think that analogy is perfect. And I want to just jot this down. There's a great, this theme actually comes up maybe with all the Nevi'im. I don't know if was it last Shabbat? Last Shabbat was Yitro, yeah. So this past Shabbat, we read the 6th chapter of Yeshayahu as the Haftarah. And that Haftarah, there's also that, the rabbis play on that in a very similar way to what they're, in other words, Yeshayahu, the rabbis take Yeshayahu to task for calling the Jewish people, for saying about them, Am Tamei Sfatayim, Ubetoch Am Tamei Sfatayim Anochi Yoshev. So that theme, and there's a very expansive, goes, which Navi Tava Kavod Ha'av V'lo Kavod Haben. I'm just going to jot that down so I can find it for you. Okay. So the rabbis are doing a few things here. First of all, it almost seems maybe the most important thing they want to do is to say that in general, a Navi has to be someone who, holds on to God's honor in that way, but also has the same compassion God has for the people, he has to have for the people. And we saw this in Moshe. You can imagine this, this theme playing in Moshe as well. But the other thing that this Gemara seems to take at face value and assume is the Gemara seems to be saying that it happened in real life, right? this Gemara, according to this Gemara, it sounds like God told the Navi to do it, and the Navi actually enacted this command, this story in his whole life. He actually really did take marry Eshet Zununim, have the 3 children, name them, and then and maybe throw her out. That may or may not come later. We'll see. So in that case, let's just play around with that for a minute. What makes that a nevuah, right? And I always remember. Wait, is this Linda Shama or Linda? Okay, either way, but the first class we talked about. Well, I talked about the Navi being the first audience, and we also talked about this Gomer, Bat Divlayim, the woman also being a first audience. So in this case, there's a real family that's involved. So what turns this into a nevuah? What is it? Why would this? How would this fit into the category of something that the Navi carrying a message to the people? It's clear how it's designed. The Gemara is very clear about how it's supposed to affect Hosea, the Navi himself. How could it have been told to the Jewish people? Because we really have to assume that anything in this book was related to the Jewish people, was spoken to the Jewish people, or delivered as a speech. So, So I think the idea is that he had this experience himself and he related it to the Jewish people, it's a very important kind of prophetic, habit or practice of Nevi'im, meaning he tells the people, this is what happened to me. God came to me. And I've mentioned to you that this whole, the idea or the technique of God telling a prophet to act out a nevuah, this is the most, by far, I think by far, Yechezkel has some very, very bizarre ones too, but I say it is the most dramatic and difficult example of a Navi acting out a nevuah. So I'm imagining him telling the people about this, but also perhaps even the people watching this play out in his town, wherever he lives, watching this Navi take this Eshet Zununim, have the children, give them names, maybe throw her out, take her back. He's actually acting it out, and because that's what happens for the other Nevi'im. They, maybe we'll do a series on examples of that. The Navi acts out, and it's like it's performance. It's a performance message. That's how he communicates the message. But that's a very intense notion. I think it makes some sense in terms of, wow, it's a very powerful means of communication. I think there are other examples in other cultures as well, but in this case, it's not like just putting a yoke on his shoulders and walking around town to communicate that, the Jewish people will have the yoke of Bavel, something like that. This is very intense, and it affects innocent people, maybe his wife, certainly the children. Okay, so on one hand, it's a very powerful Gemara, but we saw even last week, the Rambam is very uncomfortable with it, and the Rambam insists that this never really happened, but the whole episode, God's command and the carrying out of the marriage, the children, and so on, happened to Hosea in a prophetic dream. And just to go back here, God forbid to assume that the God would make his prophets, Amin, Maimonides, Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed. God forbid to assume that God would make his prophets appear an object of ridicule and sport in the eyes of the ignorant and order them to perform foolish, I got to add, immoral acts, and so on. And he says same applies to Hosea, All of this passed in a prophetic vision. When one stated that these are and we don't have to even think the Rambam is saying every time something like this happens, it's in a prophetic vision. The Rambam is like horrified by the thought this could happen in real life. Similarly, just to show you this, I'm sorry I don't have the English on here, but I'm going to translate it. Radak, later, medieval biblical commentator, in a prophetic vision. This only happened in a prophetic vision. As a metaphor for the Jewish people who are promiscuous and betraying God. Again, okay, Uperush Yaldei Zanunim, Viyula Lechami Mena Yaldei Zanunim, Ki Eshet Zanunim Hu, Hein Yisrael Hanodim Mehem, Be'ela Hadarot Zanu Me'acharei Hashem. The children are the next generations of Israel. But again, Kol Zeh B'mar'eh Nevuah, Lo Shelakach Hosea Hanavi, Eshet Zanunim. Even though even though he's aware of the Gemara that we have found in the words of our rabbis, right? The Gemara, hard to contest that it is exactly as it sounds, that it really happens in real life. And he quotes, Radak famously is very expansive, and he quotes many other opinions. And I'm scrolling down. He quotes the whole Gemara. And then he says also, Yonatan Tirgem ha'inyan al derech mashal v'nachon hu perusho. So the Gemara seems to accept it as it sounds, but Yonatan, who made Tirgem, Yonatan translated, interpreted it entirely as a metaphor, and he is right. Ibn Ezra. Hold on. Chalila v'chalila, God forbid. Sheyitzaveh Hashem lakachat eshet zununim lahodid yaldei zununim. Va'omer dayo le'eved liot kirabo lo ne'emar aleh ki Nut me'acharei Hashem derech mashal rak ba'adam hu b'ma'aseh. V'anachon b'einai, this is what I think is right. Ki zeh hanavi haya ro'eh b'marot nevuah b'chalom halayla shehashem amar lo lech kach lecha eshet zununim v'halach v'lakach isha yidu'ah v'harta v'yalda kol zeh b'marot hanevuah kasher perish. The whole thing happens only in a prophetic vision. And similarly, Yecheskel, similar to the Rambam. Okay, Abarbanel comes along, and Abarbanel, this. I don't have this in the correct. I don't have the commentators in the correct chronological order, but that's okay. Abarbanel, much later, like I think 17th century, he turns this around completely, and his reasoning is really interesting. We'll have to come back to this next week, but let's get a little start. הנה התפאר מזה שיש לנו בדבר הזה שלוש דעות. Abarbanel also very expansive, that's his style, and he'll set us up, the reader up with all the different possibilities, but then he's really going to, okay, let's see if I can skip a little bit just to give you a preview. Okay. He quotes the Gemara, right? He quotes the Gemara that we've heard. He quotes he cites Targum Yonatan. Ba'adat Hashlishi, and he quotes the Ibn Ezra and the Rambam and others, Mehamafarshim Befihem Yutu, Shehaya Koze B'Mareh Hanedivah Shenidmelo, Ki'ilu Hashem Omer, but he explains it nicely. He says, in the prophetic vision, he does say that it feels for the Navi, for Hosea, in a dreamlike state. He feels like it really happened, and therein lies its impact, right? I totally hear this, and this speaks to the Rambam and the Radak and the Ibn Ezra. I want to give these ideas a little more credence. It does detract from the power that the Navi is not actually acting this out in his own life. You can imagine that it's a degree removed from the power of his own experience. However, Abarbanel is explaining that when someone experiences something in this dreamlike state, in this particular Mareha Nevuah, שנדמה לו כאילו השם היה אומר לו כך, ונדמה לו כאילו היה עושה אותו בפועל. In other words, he really felt it. And there are dreams, sometimes you wake up from a dream and you feel it was so real and so intense that it really has a powerful, powerful impact on you. So that it doesn't totally diminish the idea that it could have been in a prophetic vision. It doesn't totally diminish the personal power, the personal impact it would have had on the Navi, and perhaps his capacity to repeat that dream to the people in a way that the message would carry a lot of power. And certainly it resolves some of the moral problems. Let's do a teeny bit of the Abarbanel, but I don't want to overstay. בפירוש ישעיהו בנבואה הי"ג תראה שלשון So if we're going to keep saying, we'll read it maybe more specifically, and maybe I'll try to translate it for you next time. If we say, if the Torah says that something happens, and we selectively say, well, this one happened in real life, but this one didn't happen in real life. Ha'im nachshisham kulam? Should we deny the reality of all of them? O neva'er lanu kirtzonenu ze emet ze sheker? Like, where does this stop and start? That we say that things never happen, but only in a prophetic vision, right? And Abarbanel is, who gave us the authority to make these choices about im ein shamot o mofet yoreh alav hakatuv? Who gave us the choices to do this? Okay, let's continue this next time. I think because I picked out a little bit, but you get where he's going. He's pushing back very strongly on the Rambam and Ibn Ezra and Radak. Now, let me leave you with this. It's not only a question of parshanut, of biblical interpretation. I think these different ways of viewing it actually speak, and not just to how to read the Bible, how to read Tanakh, but how to read the whole notion of nevuah, of biblical prophecy. What it means, I think it's a different way of thinking about what it means to be a Navi, all right? And that's why I think these voices across the ages are so important for us to look at, okay? So, all right, let's end here, unless there are questions.